I got all the parts laid out. What I like to do first is kind of the worst part is getting the spring adjusters on. If you've built a Tekno car, you know that this is a difficult thing to do. The O-rings are a little bit small, so there's a couple different tricks. One thing that I like to do is just use a fresh X-Acto blade, and you can actually take the O-ring out and just split it, cut a little bit out. So just split it with an X-Acto, cut a little bit of it out, and then just put it back in. I like to use a little bit of O-ring grease. Put it on there. Just kind of slide that around. And we should be good to go. Sometimes to get these on, you push them on, rotate it back, and then go forward, and voila, going on super smooth, not ripping your thumbs apart. Some of you that haven't built Tekno kits, you might be like, oh, that's kind of an odd thing, but if you don't do that, you will literally rip your skin off trying to get those on. So I'll go ahead, knock those 4 out real quick. Alright, boom, just like that. We got all the shock collars on. That was pretty easy, pretty simple. That's a huge help. Really good tip to get your Tekno shocks going. Next thing, we'll jump into actually building the shock cartridge pieces, getting that all together. So again, using some O-ring grease. I like to just kind of group my O-rings together. Get a bunch of grease on there. Another good thing you can do is kind of have them in like a little baggie, like when you're building your kit or something. Keep one of the plastic baggies. You can put the grease in there. That kind of keeps it a little cleaner, but I'll just do it right here on the rag. You want the O-rings to be completely coated. Silicone O-rings actually swell up a little bit with silicone oil, so you use O-ring grease to kind of protect the O-ring from getting completely saturated with the shock oil that you actually put in the shock, to keep those O-rings from swelling as much, a little bit more consistent. So now we got those. one thing I like to do is use a Q-tip, just kind of clean out the shock cartridge area, make sure there's nothing in there. These are new, but it looked like there was a little bit of dirt or dust or something in there. So it's always good to keep some Q-tips in your toolbox. Clean these out real good. There we go. Now we start putting the plastic pieces in. Got the first bushing, O-ring, spacer, O-ring, and as you can tell here, I have 4 of these small shims or bushings instead of using these tall bushings for the last piece. So a Tekno Buggy, the rear shocks call for this tall insert, and I don't use that one. I use the smaller one, which is used in the front. So you have to order another plastic internal kit from Tekno to be able to have that. But that's what I use for all 4 of the shocks. I already installed the O-ring on the shock body, so now we'll just go ahead, tighten down the cartridge, and I'll knock out these other 3 shocks the same way. Like I said, using the last bushing that goes in, I use the smaller, thinner one instead of the taller, thicker one. Alright guys, there we go. We got all 4 shock bodies ready to go. Next step we're going to do is the shock shaft. With my Tekno cars, I use the gold tinitrite shock shafts. I have my pistons all here. These are drilled out to the specs that I use in my 2.1 Buggy. So I got a front specific and a rear, so make sure that if you have different pistons front and rear that you put them correctly on the correct shock shafts. I use my Tekno tool here. If you're using a blank Tekno piston that you've drilled out with all the dimples on there, if you can see those, put that towards the top so the dimples go towards the top, the flat side goes towards the bottom. Alright, we got all 4 shock pistons on there. As you can tell, I didn't put any Loctite on those nuts. Some shock pistons you do. These have the nylon locking nuts, and I just have found that with these nuts I don't have to put any Loctite on them. I haven't had any issues with them coming loose. They seem like they work really well, stay tight on there. So I just put them on, tighten them down. You can tighten them pretty tight. The piston's not going to spin or anything. They are pretty much locked onto the shock shaft. So next thing we're going to do is put the shock shaft piston inside the shock, and I'm going to talk a little bit about internal limiting for the shocks. So when you build the kit, they don't really say to use internal limiters. I use internal limiters on my car just because I don't want the shocks to be able to go, you know, much farther than the droop that I normally run, just because when you have that happen, like if you case a jump and something like that, you can pop your drive shafts out, mainly in the rear, but it can happen in the front as well with certain cars. So I always, you know, when I go to a new car and I figure out the droop that I like, then I always try to limit the inside of my shocks for that reason, just so that I don't have any issues casing a jump or something, having my shocks, you know, pull down, flex the arm a lot to pop drive shafts out. So for the front shocks, I use those small bushing inserts that you use inside for the shock cartridge. I do one of those on each shaft, and then for the rear with these long shocks, I use 2 of these, the spacer that goes in between the O-rings, and then 1 of the tall bushings. So each one there is for 1 shaft. Now I'll go ahead, put these limiters on, put them into the shock, kind of wipe off the excess O-ring grease that we'll have. There we go. Man, new shocks sure do feel nice and smooth. Alright, now we're moving on to the rear. Alright, those are all done. Good to go. And now we can move on to the shock boots. With these Tekno boots, what I have found is if you can have 1 slit in this ridge here that locks in under the shock cartridge right there, you can just put 1 kind of slit in there. I use some of these snippers. You don't want to go all the way through, but you'll just split it. And that seems like it works good just to kind of like relieve some air and helps them from getting stuck up. That's kind of a problem sometimes with shock boots, is, you know, they just kind of get stuck up, which then kind of defeats the purpose and they're not really working right. So I do 1 slit. That seems like that does the trick pretty good. Alright, so now moving on to putting the shock ends on. We'll start with the front. There we are. I don't put any grease on these. Some people do. I don't really think it matters. Just hold the shaft. I turn these until they get kind of snug, which is right about when the threads disappear. You don't want to go too crazy because you'll go too far. If ever, you know, you're really trying to go far, if you can feel this ball being bound up, you've definitely gone too far. So that front one's good. We'll move on to this one. Like I said, just go till it's snug. We'll put these right here because they're going to be ready for oil. Alright, now on the rear, since we changed the last bushing out of the cartridge, normally you have that plastic sticking out, which changes your up travel of your shock. And since we went from the long to the short, it does change our up travel. So you need, which I thought I had this out already. You need another pair . I use the first bushing that you put in when before you put the O-rings in, the dual step one. You can use this one, or you can use two of the spacers that go in between the O-rings. So either way works fine, but you want to have your shock boot on first, and then put on the bushing, and then you put on the shock end, and this will limit the up travel to keep it the same as it was before. Sometimes too much up travel in the rear can cause some handling issues, so you don't want to do that. And there you go. You got your spacer at the bottom to limit your up travel. Alright, 4 shocks put together. Next step here is oil. These things are ready to go. There's just some tips on how I build my shocks, and yeah, hope that helps you out with your Tekno buggies.